Tonight, we gently venture into one of the most peculiar facets of medieval life, the curious diversions that brought joy to people long ago. It might surprise you to learn that in those distant days, there were no phones, no streaming stories, and certainly no escape rooms. So, what did people find solace in? Well, they raced pigs, wrestled for cheese, and, in their unassuming way, found valid entertainment in contests of flatulence. It was a world where the quietude of daily life sparked ingenuity in the most unexpected forms. If these gentle whispers from history resonate with your spirit, perhaps you might consider joining our quiet circle and, if you feel so moved, leave a soft note of where you are in the world and what time the past finds you. There is a gentle comfort in knowing others are drifting alongside us. Now, allow yourself to settle. Let the day's concerns melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. The sun, a slumbering orb, drifted gently over the hills, casting its soft, golden light across the ancient rooftops of a village whose very name had long faded into forgotten lore. Smoke curled from crooked chimneys, not in any real hurry, and the mud in the street yielded with a soft, questioning sigh beneath bare feet. And somewhere in the distance, the rooster remained silent, perhaps lost in a quiet contemplation, or simply not stirred by the urgency of the new day. Perhaps he suffered from a touch of laryngitis or a quiet existential crisis. Or maybe, after watching the same people trip over the same bucket every morning for 3 years, he decided to abstain from the familiar ritual. Whatever the reason, the silence was notably present, which lent a touch more drama to the clumsy thud of the baker's boy falling from his stool. A hushed string of words he would surely deny saying in front of his mother echoed through the bakery as he rubbed the side of his head and attributed the mishap to the very presence of the oven. The bakery itself still held the warmth from yesterday's coals, and the air within carried the lingering scent of slumber, flour, and a forgotten garment. A stubborn lump of dough, seemingly imbued with a quiet defiance, refused to awaken on the counter, while the baker, an old man with arms like ancient boughs and a spirit that could gather like a storm cloud, snored loudly behind the sacks of rye. Outside, the village stirred, unfolding itself one quiet movement at a time. A dog gently scratched its ear against the side of a cart. A pig offered a soft sneeze. Gertrude, a cow still half lost in dreams, ambled gently into a line of drying laundry. Perhaps no one truly noticed, or perhaps they simply allowed the moment to unfold. 2 elderly women settled on a bench near the well, enveloped in their shawls and the quiet weight of their accumulated wisdom. One had already mused that the sun's brightness was perhaps too bold, a possible harbinger of unsettled times. The other was convinced the rooster's silence meant someone had died, or would die, or that the sun had simply forgotten its proper course. The exact theology remained hazy, yet she was certain it held some connection to goats. A boy with a mop of hair and a tunic 2 sizes too large tiptoed past the church, holding a bucket with a single fish within. The fish seemed to hold a silent judgment, while the boy carried a visible trace of guilt. He was meant to deliver it to the reeve, but he was pondering the serious notion of consuming it himself, scales and all. He passed the tavern just as a man, with eyes still veiled by slumber, emerged, one boot absent, a chicken tucked gently beneath his arm, and a daisy nestled behind his ear. The chicken, for its part, appeared subtly perturbed. Meanwhile, the rooster, whose name had long been forgotten in the quiet rhythms of the village, stretched a single wing, ruffled his feathers, and gazed down upon the awakening world from the thatch roof of the blacksmith's shed. He watched the baker's boy burn his finger. He watched a small child fall into a puddle, remaining there, perhaps in the quiet hope that such stillness might eventually yield a sweet plum. The blacksmith's forge hissed to life. The hammering would start soon, and with it, the familiar cadence of daily toil. But not yet. For now, the village was in that in-between moment, too late to be night, too early to be properly awake, a liminal space woven from soft yawns, gentle head scratches, and the quiet deferment of morning tasks. The cows were confused. The chickens were muttering among themselves. A goat thoughtfully chewed a forgotten boot, meeting the unwavering gaze of a grandmother who, in turn, did not blink. Then came the cart. Its wheels offered a soft squeak of protest, pulled by a donkey whose eyes held the quiet knowing of journeys past. The driver, an old man with 3 teeth and a gentle, contagious laugh, offered a boisterous good morning, a sound like a gentle call to arms. Yet, silence met him, not from ill will, but because few had yet partaken of their morning mead or mushroom tea, and held a deep, quiet suspicion of such early exuberance. Finally, with a soft grunt and a gentle flap of wings, the rooster let out a sound that was a delicate blend of a sneeze caught within a yawn, followed by a telling silence and a quietly embarrassed shuffle on the roof tiles. A woman hanging laundry looked up and murmured, "About time," before snapping her sheet with a crispness that might have rivaled a banner unfurling. And just like that, the village gently surrendered to the unfolding day. Boots were pulled on, aprons tied, bread gently shoved into ovens. Children were gently chided for licking fence posts. A distant bell chimed, its purpose unknown, yet its sound carried the quiet weight of significance for all. The blacksmith's forge echoed with a rhythmic, almost musical, string of gentle exclamations. The priest gently rehearsed his sermon before a stick and a sheep, the latter of whom seemed to hold a quiet disagreement with his theology. By the time the sun was fully up, the rooster had returned to his slumber. His job, as far as he was concerned, was done. He'd made a noise. People were moving. The world, in its flawed and peculiar way, continued its gentle rotation. And, if no one had quite noticed the exact moment the day began, that was fine. It wasn't the sort of place where things started cleanly. Here, mornings did not arrive with a grand declaration. Instead, they shuffled in, perhaps losing a boot in the soft mud, and quietly hoped for no probing questions. The first true scent of morning was not the bread, nor even the fire. It was the warm, soft cadence of old porridge settling into a wooden bowl, and the subtle, unmistakable tang of a breath that had, by no stretch of imagination, recently encountered a mint leaf. In a quaint, askew cottage, the hearth offered a soft grumble. Gentle flames licked lazily at damp logs, offering a quiet protest to their task, while a woman, with a single, expressive eyebrow and a spirit not easily tried, stirred a pot that seemed to hold the echoes of countless meals. The porridge within bubbled with a quiet, almost reluctant plop, thick enough to cradle a spoon, yet thin enough to slide away when no one was looking. Her husband, already shirtless and already glistening with sweat, sat hunched over a hunk of rye so profoundly dense it might well have served as a silent testament to endurance in some kingdoms. He took a bite and paused halfway through chewing, not from pure pleasure, but from a quiet, internal calculation. Was this the same piece from yesterday, or had it been reincarnated from last week's loaf? Either way, it carried the subtle flavors of dust and unwavering commitment. Next door, a young girl was pouring repurposed ale into a cracked clay cup for her grandfather, who gently insisted it soothed his stomach, despite quiet evidence suggesting otherwise. The cup itself bore a chip shaped precisely like the bishop's nose, a detail the family often noted, yet never found cause for laughter. Outside, more hearths began their morning chorus. Wood offered a soft snap, metal a gentle clang. A distant cry of "not again" floated on the air, and a chicken was, perhaps, gently encouraged from a window. The quiet rituals of the day had indeed begun. Hygiene in the village was more akin to a gentle suggestion, a fleeting whisper, an idea one might entertain if the day's quiet rhythms permitted, which they seldom did. A man stood shirtless by a water barrel, splashing his face with a vigor that suggested a quiet yearning to erase the night's remnants. Another gently used the corner of a tunic, which quietly proclaimed its true ownership elsewhere, to wipe his nose. A woman softly scrubbed her armpits with a handful of moss, murmuring words that might have been a prayer, or perhaps a gentle curse, or both. Tooth care, too, was an art of quiet improvisation. Some gently chewed sticks, while others softly rubbed ashes onto their gums. One brave soul insisted on sour milk, claiming it deterred decay, though it also, quite effectively, deterred conversation. In one humble home, a child with tangled hair attempted to tame it by gently licking his palm and softly coaxing his curls into a semblance of order. His mother watched, saying nothing, mostly because she was too absorbed in the delicate task of removing a slug from her shoe, all without disturbing the sleeping infant nestled upon her back. The bread ovens, at least, were a source of quiet pride, that is, if one's definition of pride included guessing whether today's crust would either gently cleanse one's teeth or merely offer a subtle chip. The dough was often mixed with whatever was available: oats, barley, the last handful of seeds someone forgot to plant. On a fortunate day, a quiet walnut might appear. On a less fortunate one, a pebble. At the edge of the village, a man known only as Cricket, with a quiet smirk, kindled his stove. He gently believed his bread rose more beautifully when serenaded. The bread, it seemed, held a quiet disagreement, yet the singing continued. His neighbors offered no complaints, choosing instead to be notably vocal about their enjoyment of any other loaf. Quiet, Sacred rituals dotted the morning, like breadcrumbs laid for a path few truly followed. A few families knelt by their doors, murmuring soft blessings with half-closed eyes and stomachs that echoed with quiet emptiness. The priest's bell chimed once, its purpose a quiet mystery, for he still slept within the chapel, a candle having gently melted into his hair. One woman tied garlic to her baby's ankle to ward off unseen spirits. Another softly spat over her left shoulder after feeding the dog, just for a quiet measure of caution. A boy rubbed mud on his forehead for strength, then promptly tripped over a bucket and attributed the mishap to the mud's slow efficacy. There was a profound blend of quiet chaos and deep comfort in these unfolding rhythms. Everyone had a part to play, even if their part involved burning the stew, offering a gentle curse to the cat, or awakening with a stray turnip in their bed. No one knew how these habits started. They were simply gently passed down, quietly adopted, perhaps misunderstood, occasionally misapplied, yet stubbornly cherished. By the time the sun climbed higher, the air grew thick with the gentle scents of smoke and salt, and the quiet hope that somewhere a clean spoon might be found. The porridge had slowly begun its transformation into a substance resembling glue. The repurposed ale had already settled into a room temperature that offered no comfort. And the bread rested upon crooked shelves, offering a silent dare to any who might complain. Morning had arrived fully now, not because the rooster had offered his call, nor because a clock had marked its passage, for clocks were absent, and the rooster remained in quiet protest. No, the day truly unfurled when breath softened into chatter, when smoke began to curl from hearths, and when people, despite all, gently continued the quiet business of survival. One crust, one soft cough, one sacredly peculiar ritual at a time. They gathered with the quiet rhythm of the village, not in boisterous assembly, but in a circle of hushed intensity, more keenly felt, perhaps, than any overt danger. A gentle arc of elderly women settled near the well just after sunrise, their forms enveloped in shawls, their hands cradling strong tea, and their words often sharper than the village's finest blades. Their backs might have been bowed, yet their hearing remained acutely keen. Their knees might have ached with the passage of time, but their memories were unblemished, especially when recalling the quiet missteps of others. The well itself had been there longer than any of them. It sagged ever so slightly to the left and offered a soft creak with the shifting breeze, as if gently adding its own voice to the murmurs. A wooden bucket swung in quiet idleness on its frayed rope, seeming to listen with an invisible ear. Bertha was always first, a widow since the quiet flood of 21, not the great deluge, but the smaller one that merely nudged the pig shed astray. She arrived with her oatcakes nestled in a cloth napkin, her lips already gently pursed. Her quiet observations did not gently unfurl. They emerged warm, swift, and with a subtle edge. "Did you see the baker's wife?" She asked no one in particular. Wearing yellow, at her age, bold. Martha, who was once a midwife and now simply a professional skeptic, offered a soft sniff. Bold, or a quiet desperation. "I heard," said Agnes, the smallest, and perhaps the most subtly discerning, of the trio. that she's sweet on the Cooper, always asking for barrels she doesn't truly need. The well creaked in agreement. Or maybe it just shifted. Either way, the air grew thick with unspoken understanding, like a stew left to simmer too long over a low fire. Barrels she doesn't need, Bertha repeated, gently tearing off a corner of her oatcake with a touch more force than truly needed. That's what got her sister in trouble, too. Always needing things she didn't need. They all nodded, the kind of nod that carried the quiet weight of at least 4 decades, silently acknowledging those who walked with too much haste, smiled with too much openness, or found joy in anything with too much abandon. A 4th woman joined, limping softly, gently pulling a stool she claimed had belonged to her late husband, though its small stature quietly suggested otherwise. This was Elspeth, whose words emerged only when they could no longer be held, a rare and significant occasion. She sat, unfolded a curiously dry apple, and said, "I saw the priest leave the tavern last night with hay in his beard." A silence descended, so profound that even the birds seemed to pause their gentle chirping. "With hay?" Martha asked, and a bruise on his forehead. The oatcakes, for a moment, remained suspended. Agnes blinked as if a quiet, divine confirmation had just been bestowed. "Well," said Bertha slowly, "he did give quite the sermon on temptation last week. Said, we must all be tested." "Maybe he meant himself," said Elspeth, biting her apple, chewing with a quiet, deliberate air that felt like an unspoken declaration. A donkey passed behind them, offering a loud, braying prayer, gently pulling a cart that held no visible burdens. They did not even look. The donkey was not their concern today. Today it was the priest, the cooper, the baker's wife, and the woman from 2 cottages down who was seen planting something in the garden after midnight. What manner of herb, one might wonder, thrives at such a late hour? Martha asked, with gently raised eyebrows. "The sort that gets your chickens to lay twice as fast," muttered Agnes. "The sort that gets your husband to speak less," added Bertha. They all sighed, not with wistful longing, but with a quiet, strategic understanding. A young girl approached the well with a bucket too large for her small arms. Her eyes, wide with a quiet apprehension, offered a soft greeting as she reached for the rope. "Careful," Bertha warned. "That rope frays more every day. And if it snaps," Martha added, "you'll end up in the well and hear every word we've whispered, twice over." The girl nodded too quickly, nearly lost her grip on the crank, and retreated the moment the bucket hit the edge. She spilled half the water upon her dress, retreating without a backward glance. Agnes watched her go. "That one's too quiet." "The quiet ones," she mused, "often choose poorly in marriage." Elspeth offered a soft grunt. "The quiet ones," she added, "listen too deeply, just like us." There was a rare, soft ripple of laughter, dry and dusty, the kind that didn't shake shoulders but gently rustled shawls. They rarely admitted it, but there was a quiet affection, nestled beneath layers of gentle judgment and scattered oat crumbs. A sisterhood, born not of grand love, but of shared routines, quiet endurance, and the unspoken understanding that everyone eventually offered them a gentle thread for their conversations. They moved on to pigs next. The large pig near the churchyard had once again wandered free, consuming half a palter before being gently coaxed away with a broom. They pondered whether this rendered the pig holy or sacrilegious. Elsbeth quietly suggested it might be both, noting that some men in the village were not so dissimilar. More oat cakes were passed around, some dipped in tea, others simply gnawed upon for something to do. No one asked for recipes. They were all made with the same 3 ingredients anyway: oats, a gentle warmth, and a subtle undercurrent of quiet resilience. By the time the sun was high enough to warm the edge of the bench, the women had covered everything from those who acquired a sudden limp to those who offered a smile a touch too freely. They were not always precise, nor always entirely fair, yet they were always unfailingly, quietly observant. And tomorrow, they'd be back, the same gentle hour, the same quiet well, the same familiar oat cakes, and a fresh story to softly unravel. Inside the manor, where the walls leaned with a gentle weariness, as if burdened by the quiet weight of countless secrets, a young scribe sat hunched over a wooden desk, a position perhaps grander than his gentle talents truly demanded. His name was Lionel, though some within the manor had quietly taken to calling him Blot, not from fondness, but from the lingering memory of an inkwell once spilled, staining the bishop's sleeve, an incident no one had quite managed to forget. At this moment, Lionel was in his 5th hour of copying a legal charter so profoundly dull it might, perhaps, lull even the fiercest conflict into a quiet slumber if read aloud. It was written in Latin, a language that in Lionel's case evoked a peculiar, almost involuntary response: soft, sincere sneezes, not metaphorically, but truly, gently, sneezes. Something about the parchment, or the ink, or perhaps the subtle, heavy scent of obligation seemed to awaken his very sinuses. He dipped the quill. It dripped. He wiped the excess on a cloth once pristine, now bearing the quiet marks of countless battles with ink, as if it had survived a minor spiritual cleansing. With the quiet solemnity of a monk, he began the next line, Univers presentibus. A soft "ah-chew" erupted mid-sentence, scattering a constellation of ink across the delicate parchment. His nose, for a moment, bore the quiet mark of a man who had perhaps lost a gentle duel with a shadowy cephalopod. "Oh, for heavens," he muttered, blotting the page with such earnestness that the ink spread like a whispered secret. The steward poked his head in. Progress. Lionel offered a smile that, by all gentle appearances, teetered on the edge of quiet despair. Good. That charter must be perfect. His lordship is having it read aloud at supper tonight. Lionel blinked. Read aloud, to people, to the bishop, the magistrate, and 3 nobles who understood less Latin than he. The steward vanished before Lionel could offer a soft protest. That was the thing. No one would truly understand it. Not the bishop, who mostly offered gentle nods and blessings to whatever lay nearest. Not the magistrate, who had once, quite innocently, mistaken a recipe for a legal summons. and certainly not Lord Redgrave himself, who had gently insisted the document include a clause regarding goose ownership rights, just for a quiet measure of assurance. Lionel sighed and began again. Somewhere in the hallway, a maid dropped a tray. The crash startled him, causing his quill to flick like a nervous wand, launching a gentle stripe of ink across the floor and onto a cat that had been slumbering far too peacefully beneath his stool. The cat awakened with a soft, startled cry, launching itself onto the desk and streaking across the page, leaving delicate paw prints like tiny, quiet declarations of discontent. Lionel froze. The cat froze. Both considered the consequences. "I saw nothing," he whispered softly to the cat. The cat blinked, a quiet, unimpressed air about it, then gracefully departed the room with the silent dignity of one concluding a gentle but firm farewell. He stared at the ruined page, then at the previous four, all of them gently smudged, delicately blotted, or mysteriously sticky. One bore the quiet impression of a forgotten fly, nestled between lines like an unusual punctuation mark. Another held a faint, round trace where his teacup had once rested, unthinkingly. It wasn't that Lionel was bad at his job. He was simply entrusted with a duty that did not, perhaps, quite care for the gentle spirit of its keeper. He liked poetry. He liked stories. He once attempted to weave a quiet haiku into a land deed, merely to see if it would be noticed. It was not. Yet now, each time the town crier announced the parcel's boundaries, he unknowingly recited a gentle meditation on wind and wheat. Still, this charter had to be serious. Apparently, it concerned land use, taxation, and a clause concerning cows that carried a subtle, almost whispered, note of warning. So Lionel tried again. He sat straighter. He wiped the ink from his nose. He dipped carefully. He breathed softly through his mouth, as if to gently deter the encroaching sneezes. And he wrote, "A universist presentibus." "Bless you," a gentle voice offered preemptively from the hallway. He didn't sneeze that time, but he did spill a gentle stream of tea upon his foot. Midway through the paragraph about grain levies, he began to wonder if anyone in the manor actually read anything. The steward only glanced at margins. The lord looked for his name and any mention of ducks. The bishop offered a gentle squint, as if his spectacles had been left in a more celestial realm. Maybe, Lionel thought, this wasn't about understanding. Maybe it was about a quiet performance of authority woven into long sentences, of power expressed in gracefully curled letters, and in the solemn grandeur of unnecessarily large wax seals. He paused, then wrote a new line, "Quibustam terminus umbradis porcus raetentium," which, in its gentlest translation, meant, in certain shaded circumstances, the pig quietly rules the silence. He gazed at it, a faint smile gracing his lips, then, with a touch of reluctance, mostly crossed it out. By late afternoon, his desk was surrounded by a quiet graveyard of crumpled parchment, a half-eaten oat biscuit, and a small mouse that may have been gently perusing over his shoulder. His nose was inked again. His eyes bore a gentle cross, but the charter was in its own way. Complete. Sort of. Lionel wiped his hands on his tunic, stood, and immediately, gently knocked over the inkwell one final time. He considered a silent scream. Instead, he whispered, "I shall gently blame the cat." Then he rolled up the parchment, tied it with twine, and left the room with the gait of a man who, though perhaps having lost a quiet battle, would surely endure the greater war. The charter would be read that night, mispronounced, gently misunderstood, and quietly forgotten by morning. Yet, somewhere deep within its clauses, a delicate smudge, shaped like a paw print, would remain. A quiet testament that at least two beings had cared enough to leave their gentle, indelible mark upon it. The sun was barely up. The mist still lingered in the fields, like a quiet secret with no urgency to unfold, when Edwin was handed a bucket, a rag, and a gentle mission that would echo in his memory for seasons to come. "Go milk Gertrude," the stable master had said, gently wiping his hands on his apron, as if bestowing upon Edwin a quiet, sacred trust. "She carries a certain mood today. Be gentle." Gertrude was always in a mood. Sometimes that mood was a sleepy disdain. At other times, a quiet, determined resistance. She was the only cow in the village with her own nickname among the children, the Throne of Doom, and her gaze had been known to stir quiet reconsideration in the hearts of grown men. Still, Edwin nodded with a quiet, hesitant compliance, accepting the task, for to refuse would have meant the silent, less appealing duty of scrubbing the latrines instead. At 16, he was an apprentice in all things, yet a master of none. He had once, quite simply, tripped over his own shoe while standing still. Today he was about to learn how to milk a cow. He approached the barn with the quiet reverence of one stepping onto a hallowed, yet challenging, ground. Birds chirped overhead, unaware. The rooster finally offered a soft crow, as if to quietly acknowledge the unfolding drama. Inside, Gertrude stood, a silent statue sculpted from quiet indignation and hay. She did not meet Edwin's gaze. She looked, instead, through him, into some distant knowing. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Her tail offered a soft, deliberate flick. "Morning," Edwin offered softly, a gentle attempt at confidence in his voice. "I'm here to, the milking." Gertrude didn't respond. She shifted her weight with a subtle grace, a movement that might have been an invitation to draw nearer, or a quiet warning of impending challenge. It was difficult to discern. He placed the bucket gently beneath her, crouched on the stool that wobbled with the slightest breath, reaching out with hands that held a gentle tremor. He had been told the technique thumb and forefinger, then the rest of the fingers, like squeezing a pouch of mead, but the others felt like warm, subtly twitching balloons, and the mere touch caused a quiet flinch within him. "Sorry," he whispered to Gertrude. Gertrude offered a soft sneeze, directly onto his face. Edwin wiped his eyes and tried again. He gave one slow, cautious tug. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. He looked up, and Gertrude was chewing slowly, gazing at him with a quiet, almost knowing smirk, a look that seemed to defy the very nature of a bovine. "Please?" he asked. Somewhere in the distance, a soft rumble echoed, perhaps thunder, or merely the baker's cart. Yet, it carried a subtle, foreboding weight. He adjusted the bucket, tried a firmer grip, tugged once more. A single, hesitant squirt of milk kissed the side of the pail with a sound that seemed to softly mock his efforts. "Progress," he whispered. And then Gertrude moved. With a gentle, yet firm, twist of her body, defying both physics and bovine grace, she shifted her rear leg, delivering a precise, calculated kick that sent the bucket soaring, nudged the stool sideways, and gently deposited Edwin into a pile of straw that held the distinct, quiet scent of past regrets. "All right," he gasped softly, sprawled upon the straw, gazing up at the quiet beams above. "Not progress." Then Gertrude turned her head, snorted, resumed chewing. Edwin sat up, covered in milk, scattered straw, and a quiet sense of shame. His tunic clung to him in soft, damp patches. His hair seemed to have been gently ruffled by a confused, unseen spirit, and the bucket, now dented, lay on its side like a fallen crown. He retrieved it, dusted it off, returned to the stool with the quiet determination of a martyr, and the humble posture of a soaked field mouse. "Okay," he muttered again. This time he tried humming a soft, nervous tune that seemed to weave together the gentle notes of a lullaby and the quiet cadence of a funeral march. He gave a gentler pull, eyes closed, hoping that maybe Gertrude was the kind of cow who responded to music. To his surprise, she stayed still. A thin stream of milk began to trickle into the bucket. He didn't breathe, didn't blink, just milked slowly, rhythmically, imagining a faint, distant ripple of applause. Then came her tail. It whipped with the suddenness of a silken cord, catching him across the cheek and mouth with a soft, wet smack that carried the faint taste of earth and a quiet sense of betrayal. The bucket tipped again. The milk spilled, a quiet offering to the unseen deities of humble moments. Gertrude let out a soft, satisfied moo. By the time the stable master returned, Edwin was slumped against the barn door, his spirit gently defeated, his hands sore, his shirt quietly stained, and his expression bearing the quiet traces of a small, personal trauma. "Well?" the stable master asked, arms crossed. Edwin looked up. "She gave me something. Milk, yes, but mostly a quiet, knowing contempt." The man chuckled softly, then cast a gentle glance at the cow. "She only holds quiet respect for two," he mused, "the priest and the old widow who offers her honey oats on Thursdays. Everyone else is merely a gentle target." Gertrude snorted in agreement. Edwin stood, handed over the dented bucket, and gently wiped his hands on what remained of his quiet dignity. He wouldn't say he learned how to milk a cow that day, but he did learn, perhaps, how not to. A quiet wisdom that, in most villages, held its own gentle value. And Gertrude, she stood regal and serenely unbothered. Queen of the barn, gentle guardian of her udders, watching the boy retreat, her tail swishing in slow, quiet arcs of subtle triumph. The sun had not climbed too far when the village children were gently released into the fields for what the adults, with generous spirits, termed important work. Important, perhaps, in the quiet sense that it kept them from the bakery's temptations, away from the priest's solemn gaze, and, ideally, far from anything fragile. They were told to gather weeds from the edge of the barley rows. They were also told not to playfully strike one another with shovels, not to climb the scarecrow a second time, and not to dramatically feign demise before passing travelers. These gentle requests were, for a fleeting moment, understood, yet swiftly forgotten. A dozen or so children spilled into the fields like a flock of eager, chattering birds, armed with small shovels, humble baskets, and an energy that stirred a quiet unease in even the most stoic goats. Their clothes were patched, their shoes uneven, and their priorities very clear: to unearth something, to gently toss it, and, if the moment allowed, to dramatically, yet softly, fall afterward. Thomas, age 9, and already missing 2 front teeth from unrelated incidents, declared himself commander of dirt, and with swift authority, appointed a council from among those children who had not yet quietly retreated from his spirited pronouncements. His first decree was to form a shovel brigade. You dig, you duck, and if you get hit, you scream, he said proudly, clutching his own shovel like a young knight bearing a very flat, yet noble, sword. Marigold, the oldest at nearly 12 and far too intelligent for her environment, rolled her eyes with a quiet exasperation that almost qualified as a subtle physical exertion. She was supposed to be supervising. Instead, she found herself ducking as a soft, rotten turnip flew gently past her ear. That was a warning shot, cried a boy named Pip, who, in truth, was never quite certain what quiet warning he offered. The gentle skirmish began soon after. It was not a battle for grand lands, nor for glory, nor for honor. It was a quiet contest against boredom, a gentle vying for attention, for who could cry, "I've been struck," with the most theatrical grace, crumpling to the earth like a wounded, murmuring bard. Turnips became soft ammunition. Clumps of damp soil served as gentle grenades. Sticks transformed into staffs, and one imaginative soul fashioned a helmet from a cracked bucket and a delicate half of a bird's nest. At one point, a girl named Elsie lay gently face down in the grass, arms spread wide, softly murmuring, "Tell my goat I loved her," as if breathing her final, tender words into the whispering wind. No one questioned this quiet declaration. A younger boy, barely 5, wandered through the middle of the chaos with a dandelion crown on his head and no idea what was happening. He was gently struck by a flying potato and settled down to quietly contemplate his small life. 2 boys engaged in what could only be described as a gentle duel, flat shovels clanging together with the earnest precision of a young blacksmith and the quiet wisdom of a simple brick. One tripped, the other declared victory, and began chanting a victory song woven entirely from invented words. Everyone offered a gentle applause, then a soft boo, then applauded once more. A nearby farmer, hoe gently in hand, looked up once from his furrows, surveyed the quiet chaos, and returned to his work. He had witnessed more profound spectacles. Last spring, they had gently borrowed a wheelbarrow, racing it downhill into the river, with one emerging astride a goose, like a small, triumphant charioteer. He no longer felt the need to ask questions. Meanwhile, the weed baskets remained mostly empty. The shovels, though intended for gentle tilling, now bore the quiet marks of dents, mud, and perhaps one small, regrettable snail. No one had gathered anything remotely useful, except for a curious clump of moss, which someone gently insisted was magical, keeping it tucked in their pocket for quiet luck. Marigold eventually gave up shouting instructions and began building a quiet tower of rocks, a silent, gentle protest. It was, at least, a productive endeavor. For a while, it reached an impressive height before someone, mistaking it for a small, enemy fortress, gently demolished it with a well-aimed parsnip. There was a single, fleeting moment of truce when someone announced the discovery of a rabbit hole. Everyone gathered, wide-eyed and quietly reverent, hoping for a glimpse of soft ears. The rabbit did not appear. Instead, they gently debated its name, offering suggestions like Sir Flop, Mud King, and Dirt Jesus. No quiet decision was reached. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the field where children lay, sprawled like small, fallen soldiers, clutching their sides and murmuring with soft laughter. They were stained with grass, dust, and several substances best left to quiet mystery. Their hands bore gentle blisters, their hair was adorned with burrs, and their faces glowed with the quiet satisfaction of a good, playfully pointless skirmish. A bell rang faintly from the village square, signaling lunchtime. There was a collective, soft groan, not from hunger, but because their quiet war had just begun to unfold its true charm. Still they rose, gently shaking off the day's dirt and their playful honor, making their slow, quiet retreat back through the fields. Thomas walked with a gentle limp he most certainly had not possessed moments before. Marigold carried a single weed in her basket, more symbolic than truly useful. Pip clutched a lump of turnip like a quiet trophy. Gertrude the cow watched them pass with a deep, bovine, and utterly silent judgment. Back in the fields, the overturned soil bore the quiet marks of a morning gently, yet thoroughly, spent. Small footprints, broken roots, the scattered remnants of vegetables pressed into service as playful weapons. The weeds still stood tall, but so too did the quiet, unfolding stories. Midday in the village did not announce itself with a clear bell, nor a sharp whistle, nor even with much certainty. It arrived, instead, in the soft rumblings of stomachs, grumbling ones, growling ones, and small ones that echoed like a hollow cave when gently prodded. It arrived in the way a man gently wiped sweat from his brow, gazing toward the sun, hoping it had ascended high enough to quietly justify chewing something, anything, even if it held the humble taste of bark. Lunch, as a gentle concept, was often more a quiet hope than a firm plan. Some families prepared for it like a ritual. Others stumbled into it like a quiet, unexpected trap. And many, especially the children, simply accepted that it would be whatever they could gently catch, quietly acquire, humbly find, or chew swiftly enough to avoid question. In the bakery, what little bread remained from the morning was crusted, firm, and held a faint warmth, if cradled long enough beneath one's armpit. The baker's apprentice gently gnawed on a slice, while quietly pretending to sweep. It carried the subtle tastes of flour, smoke, and a soft apology. Out in the pasture, 3 boys gently argued over the last scoop of stew in a wooden bowl. The stew was grey, a curiously muted grey. No one could quite recall its origins, though one quietly swore it held turnip. Another gently insisted on beetroot, while the third simply murmured, "Bones," refusing to offer further detail. They decided the only fair way to settle it was a race to the nearest tree and back. The winner, with a quiet gulp, consumed it, while the others watched with a blend of gentle envy and soft concern. By the well, an old woman unwrapped a cloth and revealed a hunk of cheese so profoundly aged it seemed to have quietly acquired a personality of its own. It carried the subtle sense of earth and a gentle defiance. She cut it with a knife that had witnessed many centuries, placing a small piece into her mouth and declaring it tangy. A generous assessment. A dog sat nearby, hopeful. She offered it a crumb. The dog, after a gentle sniff, quietly departed. A little girl with dirt on her chin and daisies in her hair gently tugged a radish from someone else's garden. She glanced both ways, then bit it in half. It was peppery, sharp, and deliciously, quietly forbidden. She wiped her mouth with her sleeve, stashed the other half in her pocket for later, and skipped away with the light-hearted gait of a small, unburdened transgressor. The tavern naturally had food, if one could pay, which most couldn't. But the tavern keeper's son held a soft spot for quiet tales of woe and wide, pleading eyes. He gently slipped 2 boiled eggs and a piece of stale pie to a passing widow who claimed she hadn't eaten since Tuesday it was Thursday. She offered a subtle wink as she quietly walked away. Some meals were more creative. A boy named Lyle carried a squirrel, which he gently insisted he had found already like that. His plan to roast it was quietly interrupted by his mother, who confiscated it and buried it beneath the herb patch, murmuring something about quiet curses. He made do with a clump of sorrel and an apple he had, quite gently, dropped twice. Near the church steps, 2 girls took turns, gently licking honey from a twig. They had found it near the beekeeper's fence, quietly claiming it had simply fallen. It had not, but they were swift, and the beekeeper was old. And so, the honey now belonged to the gentle whims of fate. They giggled softly between licks, dipping their fingers into the jar they had not stolen, but rather quietly adopted. An apprentice blacksmith, covered in soot and a quiet pride, gently munched on a roasted onion as if it were a cherished prize. No bread, no salt, just the humble onion. His breath, for a moment, cleared a 6-foot radius around him, a quality he rather enjoyed. He called it his warrior seasoning. Out by the edge of the woods, an old man cooked something in a pot over a low, gentle fire. No one truly knew what. He never spoke of it. Sometimes he whistled softly while stirring. Sometimes he simply gazed into the pot, as if it whispered quiet secrets. Once, someone, with a gentle curiosity, peeked in and saw a birdfoot and what might have been a pear. No one asked a second time. Not all meals were found on the ground or quietly acquired or questionable. In one cottage, a mother handed out slices of oatcake and boiled carrots, calling each child by name, as if they were cherished, noble guests. The humble food was not grand, yet the children beamed like quiet royalty. One boy even offered a small bow before gently biting his carrot. She, in turn, offered a soft curtsy. By mid-meal, the air was filled with the gentle sounds of chewing, soft slurping, quiet spitting, and one faint, hushed argument over who had first licked which cheese. It was not elegant, nor was it perfectly clean, but it was simply lunch. A man on the road stopped for a handful of roasted barley from a pouch on his belt. It carried the subtle taste of burnt earth, yet he offered no complaint. Another traveller gnawed on a heel of bread he'd been saving since the last village. He offered a gentle bite to his mule, who, with quiet dignity, declined. The children, who had nothing, played a quiet game with a walnut shell and 2 pebbles, gently pretending it was a grand feast. One mimed drinking a rich soup. Another declared her rock too spicy. They all quietly agreed it was the finest lunch they had never truly had. Eventually, bellies quieted. Crumbs settled into forgotten corners. Lips were gently wiped. Teeth were thoughtfully picked. And across the village, people returned to their tasks with the slow, quiet satisfaction of enduring survival. Because in the end, it didn't matter what it was or where it came from. If one could gently catch it, quietly chew it, or simply bluff one's way through its consumption, then it was lunch. And that, in its quiet simplicity, was enough. The shoemaker's cottage rested, a quaint, crooked dwelling, near the square's edge. A humble, squat place with one shutter perpetually askew, and a front step that offered a soft, protesting creak beneath each footfall, especially those of the shoemaker himself, whose steps were known to be the heaviest, the slowest, in the entire village. Some whispered it was a deliberate pace. Some attributed it to the shoes he crafted, and others said it was simply the quiet weight of a man carrying years of unspoken rebellion within his very arches. Inside, the air held the gentle scents of leather, dust, and quiet secrets. Soft sunlight filtered through a cracked window, gently illuminating motes that danced idly above a cluttered workbench, strewn with delicate scraps, threads, and boots in various states of completion. It was a place of quiet industry, of gentle craftsmanship, and of whispered snores that, if one listened closely, seemed to belong to a spirit less burdened by the day's demands. because the cobbler was not stitching or hammering or measuring, at least not in any way that produced footwear. He was gently curled beneath the bench. Shoes, like tiny, mismatched guardians, surrounded him, a boot with a hole in the heel, a slipper missing its twin, a sandal whose buckle, so rusted, had become a quiet philosophical query. The cobbler lay on his side, his hat tipped low, mouth gently ajar, one hand softly tucked beneath his cheek, as if he had slipped into a quiet childhood slumber mid-task. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate rhythm that spoke of a man profoundly unawakened and profoundly unbothered by that state. If you asked him, if you knocked or coughed or stepped inside loudly enough to wake the floorboards, he would insist he was gently measuring souls. Sometimes, when a poetic mood softly touched him, he would claim he was conversing with the leather. Once, after a particularly long doze, he even insisted he had been meditating on arches. Everyone, with quiet understanding, allowed him that small comfort. The truth was far simpler. He was tired, and the bench, cramped though it was, had transformed into a quiet sanctuary. In his dreams, he was always partaking of mutton pies, mostly thick, hot ones with delicate, flaky crusts and gravy that seemed to defy all earthly logic. Sometimes there were soft potatoes. Sometimes a flagon that gently refilled itself, as if the dream knew precisely how much his spirit yearned for. No one ever gently interrupted him in these dreams. No one asked for new heels, nor to tighten an instep, nor if he could mend a buckle before Sunday. Only pie, and quiet, and the soft hum of a world where everything nestled perfectly. Above him, life carried on. A young man stepped into the shop, looked around, and called out, "Master Cobbler." No answer. He frowned, leaned over the counter, and caught sight of a boot twitching ever so subtly beneath the bench. A faint, soft snore gently confirmed his quiet suspicion. He waited a respectful moment, then tiptoed out, deciding, with quiet understanding, that the shoe could wait another day. No one wanted to be the one who woke the cobbler. Not because he was angry, he wasn't. He was just slow to return. His eyes took a gentle while to focus. His words emerged like soup that had not quite reached a simmer. And once, he, quite innocently, mistook a broom for a customer, attempting to sell it a pair of sandals. Back in the shadow of the bench, the cobbler gently smacked his lips and smiled in his sleep. The mutton pie, it seemed, was particularly tender today. Outside, the village offered its gentle hum. The blacksmith's hammer rang out with a sound like distant church bells. Children's soft shouts punctuated a game of chase the chicken. The miller murmured a gentle curse about something that was, most likely, his own quiet doing. And in the midst of it all, the shoemaker slumbered on, undisturbed, enveloped in the comforting scent of tanned hide and a gentle, baked fantasy. His apprentice, a lanky boy named Joss, eventually poked his head in. He spotted the boots in progress, the scattered tools, the lack of movement, and sighed with the quiet weariness of a man twice his years. "Again," he softly muttered. He walked behind the bench, crouched, and gently slid a rolled-up piece of felt beneath the cobbler's neck. The old man shifted ever so slightly, murmured something soft about gravy, and settled deeper into his quiet slumber. Joss didn't mind. He cherished the quiet. He cherished the way the shop felt like a shared, gentle secret. He even cherished that his master sometimes dreamed instead of toiled. It lent the shoes he did finish a touch more magic, as if they had emerged from a place not quite of this world. Back under the bench, the cobbler's fingers twitched with a soft, gentle rhythm. Perhaps he was tying an imaginary shoelace. Perhaps he was reaching for another tender bite of pie. No one would ever truly know. A spider wandered softly across his boot, paused with a quiet consideration, and then, with a subtle shift, thought better of it. The soft snoring grew even softer. The light shifted, tracing new patterns. Time passed, as it always did in the village, unhurried, filled with quiet, gentle corners. Eventually, he'd wake up. He'd stretch, gently smack his lips, pretending he had merely been checking a seam. He might even murmur, "Ah, yes, it's nearly ready," as if the shoe beneath his bench had been quietly ripening, like a fine cheese. But for now, the cobbler slept, surrounded by shoes, dreaming of pie, and not a single soul, with gentle reverence, dared to awaken him. The bell offered a soft, distant toll over the village, a gentle whisper that evening vespers were quietly approaching. Chickens offered soft squawks in distant corners. Dogs barked with a quiet fervor, as if guarding the very heart of faith, and the air began to settle into that peculiar, soft hush, lending every shadow a gentle, elongated presence. In the chapel, Father Aldrich stood with the quiet stillness of a statue, a posture that would have been noble, were it not for the subtle panic gently creeping across his face. He had at that moment forgotten everything, save for his name that he remembered and his sacred purpose of which he felt fairly certain. But the sermon, the delicate scroll, the very passage from Luke he had been softly murmuring all morning while feeding the geese, had utterly, gloriously, vanished from his mind, like smoke through a sieve. He glanced around the sacristy, which resembled less a sacred preparation space and more the inside of a cupboard that had quietly surrendered to its fate. Robes were draped softly over chairs. Candles leaned with a gentle weariness against the walls. A chalice rested, inverted, upon a stack of hymnals that had for 3 months quietly supported a crooked stool. Somewhere, a mouse scurried with the quiet confidence only divine proximity could bestow. "All right," Father Aldrich muttered to himself, gently lifting papers, lifting books, lifting even a crust of bread that had, in its quiet way, become a subtle theological hazard. "Where did I had it this morning." He checked under the table. Behind the altar, in the cabinet where he once, quite innocently, locked a vestment for Lent and didn't remember until Pentecost. The scripture was not there. Then he noticed something else, something colder. He looked down. No shoes. His feet, pale and subtly alarmed by the cold stone floor, seemed to blink back at him, as if to quietly ask, "Good sir, why are we naked in God's house?" Oh, Not again, Aldrich whispered, shuffling toward the far corner, where he kept what he fondly called his emergency shoes. A mismatched pair once worn by a monk, with one leg ever so slightly longer than the other. He slid them on with the quiet resignation of a man who understood that both fashion and symmetry were gentle sacrifices made long ago in service to a higher, more profound calling. Outside, the village was already gathering. The baker's wife stood in gentle conversation with the apothecary, perhaps discussing yeast or, more subtly, sin. A handful of children playfully tossed pebbles at the chapel door, in what they gently insisted was a game, and certainly not a low-grade heresy. And somewhere near the steps, Old Man Trigg had softly fallen asleep against a barrel, likely to remain there until someone, in the quiet darkness, gently stumbled upon him. Father Aldrich gently wiped his forehead. Vespers, he murmured. Evening vespers. That means light, hope, repentance. Shoes. He blinked. No, he had shoes now. A gentle misstep in thought. He grabbed the nearest Bible, flipping through its pages as if searching for a quiet recipe, landing on something vaguely familiar: loaves, fishes. Yes, he would weave it into a tale of abundance, of trusting the gentle process, of how even when things seem lost, something greater quietly finds its way. Perfect, he thought, symbolic, relevant, vaguely edible. As he straightened his robe and tucked the candle wax stains into a fold no one would see, he murmured a short prayer, not for the words of his sermon to return, but for the quiet strength to simply survive it. His memory had never been strong. He had once, quite innocently, read a marriage blessing over a baptism. The baby, of course, did not mind. The couple departed, confused, yet strangely, gently hopeful. He stepped out of the sacristy and into the soft, amber light of the chapel. The villagers turned, their faces sleepy, warm, and quietly expectant. He offered them a smile, the kind a man gives when he has just, quite suddenly, remembered his fly is down, and there is nothing, in that moment, to be done. "Good evening," he said, voice echoing just a touch more than intended. Tonight's reading is about trust. He held up the Bible like a gentle shield. No one could truly discern the page. He wasn't even entirely certain it was right side up. "There are times," he began, "when we are sure we've prepared. We've done all we're meant to do. And yet, we find ourselves standing barefoot in the gentle house of God." A pause, a soft breath, a knowing glance down at his own mismatched shoes. A quiet, gentle chuckle rippled through the room. He pressed on. "We forget things, small, quiet things. Where we left the bread, where we left our temper, where we left a scroll holding our entire sermon for the evening. But God remembers, even when we, in our quiet human way, do not." A soft murmur of approval. Someone in the back whispered, "That's true," and another gently shushed them with a loving, quiet elbow. Father Aldrich smiled, more genuine now. The panic had softened into a gentle rhythm, into a quiet improvisation. He found the parable, after all, tucked in the soft folds of memory, not word for word, but heart for heart. "And so we gather," he said, "not to be perfect, but to be gently present." By the end, no one knew he hadn't planned a word of it. They left feeling lighter, if not necessarily holier. The children ceased their gentle pebble tossing. Even old man Trigg stirred once, offered a soft belch, and quietly muttered, "Amen." Back in the sacristy, Aldrich sat down with a gentle weariness, kicked off the uneven shoes, and exhaled softly into his hands. He had no idea where he had left the original sermon, but as he leaned back and closed his eyes, a gentle dream of mutton pies floated through his thoughts. And for just a quiet moment, he did not mind forgetting. In the beet field, just beyond the village, where the soil gently clung to one's boots, as if holding a quiet, tender attachment, love, or something subtly akin to it, was gently unfolding. Her name was Anwin. His name was Tom. Both 17, they found themselves rather clumsy at most things, save for the delicate art of pretending not to care for one another. The sun held its high place, the beats offered a gentle stubbornness, and the silence between them was thick, a soft presence that might be cut with a scythe. Tom was supposed to be working. So was Anwin. The village had declared this part of the field communal, which meant everyone took turns gently pretending to care for the beet harvest, while mostly sharing quiet chats and soft arguments over who received the largest roots. Today, Tom and Anwin had been gently paired together, perhaps by the silent gods, or more likely by Marigold, who, with quiet knowing, understood precisely what she was doing. They worked side by side, in a quiet, almost tentative way. Tom gently cleared his throat. "Some of these beets are quite round today," he offered softly. Anwin looked up, a beet held gently in her hand, a trace of dirt on her nose. "Yes, very beet-like." He nodded. "This one," he added, "looks like my uncle's head. Is that a compliment?" she asked. "No," he replied. She smiled. Nonetheless, a bird chirped in the distance, perhaps sharing a quiet, knowing chuckle. Tom gently wiped his hands on his tunic, a gesture that only deepened the quiet stains. He tried again, a soft attempt. "I saved you a good one," he said, holding up a beet with a lopsided, faintly carved grin upon its skin. "It looks as if it's smiling," he murmured. Anwin took it, held it, gave it a serious look. "It does," she replied, but in a subtly mischievous way. "Like your sister." Anwin gasped, a soft intake of breath. "Take that back." "I won't." She gently tossed a clump of soil at his boot. He dramatically, yet softly, fell backward into the yielding earth, arms spread as if struck by a gentle, lightning beat. She laughed, a touch too loudly. He remained down a little longer than truly necessary. "I was only joking," he murmured from the ground. "I know," she replied, A quiet pause settled between them. Do you think, he ventured carefully, that if you were a beat, just hear me out, you'd be a very fancy one? Fancy, you know, regal, the kind they only serve on feast days. Anwin sat back on her heels. And you'd be the one with the wormhole. Charming. A cart rattled by on the nearby road. Neither of them noticed. She plucked a leaf from a nearby plant and twirled it. My mother says I shouldn't talk to boys in the field. My mother says I shouldn't talk at all. And yet here we are. Do you talk to other boys? He asked too quickly. Anwin raised an eyebrow. Do you ask that of every girl who throws dirt at you? No, just the ones who catch my eye while elbow deep in tubers. She flushed, not visibly, but in the way she blinked a little slower and looked away, like she suddenly remembered how interesting dirt could be. I don't talk to many boys, she said after a moment. Most of them don't say anything worth hearing. Tom tried not to smile so big it scared the birds. I once wrote a poem. He offered about turnips. Anwin lit up. Recite it. It's terrible. All the best ones are. He sat up, wiped his hands, and with all the dignity of a farmer knight, he cleared his throat. Oh, turnip stout and pale and round, thy leaves like hats upon the ground. Thy flesh is firm, thy spirit true, but still, I'd rather look at you. He looked at her. She blinked, then snorted, then laughed until she had to hide her face in her apron. You're an idiot, she said between giggles. You liked it. I loved it. But if you ever say it out loud again, I'll bury you in beets. Romantic. They sat there for a moment, not touching, not moving, just a shared silence filled with beat, breath, and awkward potential. In the distance, a goat bleed. I like goats, Tom said. Anwin tilted her head. That was smooth. I'm warming up. My father would kill you. I'm very fast. He's got a crossbow. I'm not that fast. They grinned at each other, and it was the kind of grin that made the rest of the world slightly blurry for a few seconds. Do you want to walk back together? She asked softly. Now, even if I didn't, I'd say yes. I figured. She stood, brushing soil from her skirt. He scrambled to stand beside her, and for a moment, they stood awkwardly, shoulder to shoulder, pretending the wind was more interesting than it was. She handed him the smiling beat. For your poem collection. He took it like it was a relic. I'll treasure it. They started walking slowly together, one step apart, then half. He reached for her hand, then pulled back. She noticed, didn't say anything, just let the silence stretch kindly between them. Behind them, the field was full of crooked rows and half-filled baskets, and the echoes of laughter that still hadn't entirely died down. Love in the beet field was clumsy. It was chaste. It was a disaster made of blushing cheeks and shared vegetables. But for Tom and Anwin, it was everything. At the edge of the monastery grounds, past the herb garden, and behind the crumbling stone wall, where no one bothered to weed, lived Brother Cuthbert. He had a cell of his own, technically, though he was rarely in it. He preferred the woods or the pond, or crouched behind the chapel, whispering to slugs depending on the day. Cuthbert was not like the other monks. For one, he collected owl feathers, Not quills, not relics. Feathers, hundreds of them, sorted by length, hue, and what he called emotional aura. He kept them tucked into his robe sleeves, like bookmarks for thoughts he hadn't finished thinking. Sometimes they'd fall out mid-conversation, and he'd chase them with the urgency of a man rescuing Holy Scripture. He also talked to trees, not metaphorically, not in the literary poetic way, literally with pauses, with questions, with nods of serious understanding. He referred to the oak near the well as Father Elrich, and often told the novices that the maple by the brook wept sap for sinners. Some people hear angels. He once said, "I hear bark." And then there were the spoons. Brother Cuthbert carved spoons with a skill that could only be described as unsettling. No one had taught him. One day he picked up a crooked twig, muttered something about hidden shape, and by sunset had produced a ladle so elegant the abbot refused to use it for fear of spiritual offense. Every spoon was different. Some had handles shaped like spirals, others like bird beaks. One had the faint face of a woman etched into its bowl, and no one could look at it too long without feeling like they owed her an apology. The kitchen had dozens, yet the cook insisted on using only one. The rest were for show, or possibly for defense, depending on her mood. No one really knew where Cuthbert had come from. He arrived one misty morning with a satchel of moss, 3 acorns, and a carved badger he claimed could smell sin. The abbot, having once spent 6 hours chasing a goose through the cloister, decided he had no grounds to turn anyone away and welcomed him. Since then, Cuthbert had become both a curiosity and a legend. Novices whispered that he once healed a pigeon with just his breath. Others said he'd been struck by lightning twice and thanked the sky both times. A few insisted he kept a journal written entirely in bird footprints. When asked, he only smiled and said, "Some truths are feathered." The villagers regarded him with a blend of reverence and alarm. Children left him offerings of dandelions and buttons. Old women crossed themselves when he passed, but asked for talismans just in case. Young men dared each other to ask him questions like, "What do you dream about?" and then fled when he actually answered. Mostly echoes. He once said, "Sometimes jam." One day, the abbot tried to assign him a formal duty. Script copying. Cuthbert agreed and promptly filled a parchment with drawings of frogs in various hats. When asked what gospel this was, he replied, "Mark, probably." If he'd had more frogs, they moved him to gardening. He planted in spirals. The cabbage sprouted in a circle that seemed to repel snails. The lettuce grew in the shape of a fish, accidentally honoring an obscure saint. No one argued. The produce was excellent. And yet, for all his oddness, Cuthbert was beloved. He never missed morning prayers, even if he arrived wearing a crown of thistles or dripping wet from some silent encounter with the stream. He listened better than anyone. When Brother Alwyn's mother died, Cuthbert sat with him all night, saying nothing, just whittling a spoon shaped like a weeping willow. He once scared off a bandit with a long stare and a handful of dried mushrooms. The bandit returned a week later to return a borrowed staff and ask if Cuthbert could bless his goat. The spoon carver did solemnly with 3 owl feathers and a chant that may or may not have been improvised. The goat was never the same, in a good way. At meals, he rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always something no one expected. "The moon is a borrowed tooth," he said once, mid-pottage. No one asked what he meant. They just nodded. It felt true. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he could be seen dancing barefoot behind the chapel. Slowly, gracefully, arms outstretched, like he was listening to a hymn only the dirt could sing. No one stopped him. In fact, a few of the younger monks started joining him, though clumsily and always in silence. Was he mad? Maybe. Was he wise? Possibly more than any of them. But most agreed he was something else entirely. A question the monastery had been lucky enough to receive without needing an answer. So he whittled, he wandered, he whispered to the trees. And the trees, if you listen closely, if you really listened, sometimes whispered back. Down by the river, where the reeds swayed like nosy old men, and the water moved slow enough to hear secrets, the women gathered with baskets of laundry and mouths already half open. The sun was still stretching its arms above the hills, but the gossip had already begun. Laundry day was never really about laundry. It was about the rhythm of scrubbing and speaking, about pounding stains out of tunics while casually destroying reputations. The soap was made of ash and lard, rough as sand and just as unforgiving. Clothes got clean, sure, but what really sparkled was the conversation. The older women arrived first, wrinkled hands, sharp eyes, tongues oiled and ready. They laid out their linens like battle plans, rolled up their sleeves, and set to work with the precision of executioners. Each slap of a wet garment against the stone was punctuation. "Did you hear what Ma's boy did with that hedge girl?" One of them asked, tossing a shirt down with flair. "No," said another, lathering a sock that had seen things. "But I hope you're about to tell me." And so the tale began. Half true, half invented, all delicious. Younger women trickled in next, laughing, yawning, clutching damp bundles. They greeted their elders with respectful nods and took their places along the shore, feigning modesty. But their ears were wide open, their hands scrubbing absent-mindedly, their minds already stitching together what they'd heard last week with what they'd overhear today. Somewhere down the line, a girl named Brenna dropped a tunic into the river by accident. She shrieked and ran after it, splashing wildly, only to be met with cheers and applause from the rest. When she returned, dripping and defeated, an older woman handed her a cloth and said, "That tunic floated better than your chances with the butcher's son." Laughter. It wasn't all cruelty. There was warmth in the teasing, a kind of rough affection wrapped in sarcasm. They picked at each other like birds, but if anyone else tried it, they'd defend each other with fists and soap bars. Midway down the bank, two sisters, Ida and Ro, worked side by side, elbowing each other as they scrubbed. Ida was quiet, which made her a favorite target. So Ro said, eyes forward, voice casual, "You and Will, the miller's apprentice, were walking awful close last market day." Ida didn't respond, just wrung out a tunic with more force than was strictly necessary. "You were smiling." He said something funny. He's never said anything funny in his life. A pause. Then Ida, voice just above a whisper, replied, "He said he likes my laugh." Ro blinked. Oh, there it was. An accidental confession not meant to be shared. Already too late. Ro grinned like a cat. That's going to cost you 3 weeks of firewood chores, if you want me to keep that quiet. 2 done. At the far end, near a cluster of trees, a woman named Alfreda hummed while beating a tunic that clearly belonged to her husband. With every slap, her hum grew louder. No one asked questions. Eventually, the confessions started slipping out like they always did. Half laughing, half daring. That's the thing about repetitive work. It loosens the tongue. The arms move on instinct, and the mouth forgets to be careful. I never liked the midwife, someone said, scrubbing hard. She smells like sour milk and makes too many comments about hips. I kissed my cousin once, another offered. And then, but it was dark and I didn't know until afterward. I put nettles in my mother-in-law's bedding. Gasps, cackles. I think my husband's having dreams about that tavern girl. You think? Mine moans her name in his sleep. They howled. One woman laughed so hard, she dropped her lye bucket into the river and had to wade in after it, while muttering prayers that were only technically in Latin. A soft breeze rustled the trees overhead. Birds chirped oblivious. A frog plopped into the shallows and instantly regretted it. By late morning, the riverbank was a patchwork of drying cloth, damp skirts, and freshly released secrets. Some of the women lay back on the grass, catching their breath. Others kept scrubbing, not because the clothes needed it, but because it gave their hands something to do while their minds untangled new rumors. A girl who'd barely spoken all morning suddenly said, "I think I want to marry someone who doesn't live here." Silence. Then a quiet voice replied, "Good luck finding one who wants to live with you." More laughter. Eventually, the sun climbed too high, and the work began to slow. Baskets were refilled, tunics folded. The river, now cloudy from soap and sins, gurgled softly, as if promising to hold their secrets, at least until tomorrow. As they trudged back to the village, arms full and mouths still moving, one thing was certain. Before the next bell rang, every one of those confessions would echo off someone else's kitchen wall. The clothes would be clean, but the stories, never. He arrived with a lute slung over his back and the swagger of someone who mistook mild applause for prophecy. The villagers welcomed him, of course. That's what you did when a minstrel came through. Offer him a bowl of soup, a spot near the fire, maybe a place in the barn if he didn't smell too badly. He'd play a few songs, tell a tale or two, then vanish with the next cart of turnips. But this one stayed. At first it was charming. His name, he insisted, was Sir Eldrick of the 7 Strings, though no one could confirm whether that referred to his lute or something more anatomical. He wore a hat with an absurd feather and spoke in poetic riddles, even when asking for directions to the outhouse. "In the year of our Lord, may I inquire where yon latrine doth reside?" he once asked old Murder, who simply pointed and muttered, "Over there, and don't yawn me." He performed in the square every evening without fail. The first night, the children danced. The second, the butcher's wife clapped along. By the 5th, most people found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, like checking on non-existent goats or rearranging firewood. The problem wasn't just that he stayed. It was that he only knew 3 songs. Exactly 3. One about a brave knight who loved a swan, which grew less romantic the more you thought about it. one about a miller's daughter and some deeply questionable metaphors, and one called The Wind Doth Moan for Thee, which involved a lot of moaning, literal moaning. He hit the same note at least 17 times. When asked if he knew anything else, he'd smile like he'd been mistaken for royalty and reply, "Ah, but these are sacred tales crafted under moonlight and muse and overcooked," muttered the baker's son. It wasn't just the songs, though. It was how every tale began. In the year of our Lord. Didn't matter what he was talking about. A dragon in the year of our Lord. A beast of flame. A stolen pie. In the year of our Lord, a most wicked pastry vanished. Once he tried to explain the rules of a dice game to the blacksmith, using the same opening. The blacksmith nodded politely, then threw the dice into the fire. He lingered at the inn, strumming softly, waiting for someone to ask for a tune. No one did. He wandered into the chapel, claiming the acoustics helped him commune with the divine, though the priest gently asked him to stop turning psalms into limerick. He wandered the fields, serenading cows. "They're more forgiving than people," he said one afternoon, sighing beside Gertrude, the largest and least impressed of the herd. By the second week, he began inserting himself into conversations. "You know, in the year of our Lord, don't," someone would say, but he would. The children began avoiding him, fearing another rendition of the swan song. The apothecary swore her sleeping draughts were selling better than ever. The innkeeper, who had initially offered a straw pallet out of courtesy, started hinting that the weather was fine enough to sleep under the stars. Eldritch took this as a compliment to his endurance. He wasn't entirely useless. He helped carry baskets. He once patched a hole in the tavern roof, though he sang while doing it. He was polite, clean somehow, and never stole a thing. But his presence clung like flour dust everywhere. Impossible to remove. Slightly sweet, but mostly annoying. A secret meeting was held behind the granary. What if we tell him there's a music contest in the next town? He'll come back with a trophy. Can we bribe him with what? Our remaining patience. Someone suggested sending him into the forest to serenade bears. Another floated the idea of marriage. Surely, someone in a far-off village would take him eventually. But no one had the heart to be cruel. He meant well. He smiled like a dog that didn't know it had tracked mud into the chapel. And he was trying, always trying. One evening, the village gathered around the well. A cool breeze stirred the lanterns. Eldritch appeared, lute in hand, eyes shining. "Friends," he began. "In the year of our Lord, groans, audible groans, I shall perform a new piece." Head snapped up. "New?" He cleared his throat, strummed once, then silence. "I forgot the second verse," he said sheepishly, "but I remember the chorus. It was unfortunately the moaning part. Still, he sang it. People laughed, not at the song, but at the spectacle. Someone handed him a crust of bread. A child danced badly, and for a moment, the irritation faded. He was still terrible, but he was theirs now. Every morning, just after the sun spilled across the thatched rooftops, and long before anyone truly wanted to be awake, the village reeve began his round. He walked with the ceremonial authority of someone who'd been given a job no one else wanted, but everyone was happy to let him keep. His name was Eden, and he took boredom more seriously than most men took their vows. He wore the same brown cloak every day, which somehow managed to look both stiff and sagging, like it had opinions, but lacked the courage to share them. A small wooden badge hung around his neck to prove his office, though most villagers assumed it was a token from a failed romance. He walked slowly, as if each step had been pre-approved by a committee, and in a way it had. The job of Reeve, after all, was mostly about appearances. He began at the east fence, where the slats had been half missing since Candlemas. He squinted at the damage, rubbed his chin thoughtfully, and moved on without comment. That was the ritual. Check the fences. Don't fix the fences. Pretend you're making a list of the fences. Morning, Reeve, called a voice from the cowpen. Eden nodded. A fair morning to you, Hilda. Fences down again. Yes, he said with the gravity of a man reporting on war. I've noticed. He did not stop. If he stopped, someone might ask him to do something. So he walked past the broken fence, past the one held together with a belt, past the one that had been replaced entirely with bundles of dried reeds and wishful thinking. The next stop was the grain store. He checked the lock, which wasn't locked. He checked the hinges, which were mostly rust and prayer. He tapped the wood twice, his version of an inspection, and moved on. Inside, a mouse stared at him with the confident gaze of someone who paid no taxes. He walked the perimeter of the pasture where the sheep sometimes remembered to stay. A few stared at him, unimpressed. One followed briefly, then got bored. Eden stopped to inspect a gate that was technically attached, but mostly leaning. He placed one hand on it, sighed deeply, then stepped back and gave it a nod as if to say, "You're doing your best." By mid-morning, he reached the manor's outer wall. It was solid, imposing, and entirely outside his jurisdiction. He stared at it anyway, just to feel included. A servant passed, carrying a basket of apples. "Rev," she said with a small curtsy. Walls seem sturdy, he noted, gesturing vaguely. She looked at the wall, then at him, then kept walking. At the well, he paused to inspect the bucket rope for fraying. It had frayed last spring and frayed further every week since. But so long as the water still came up and no one drowned, it remained a future problem. Eden tugged at it once. The bucket creaked. Satisfied, he moved on. His notebook was mostly blank. He sometimes pretended to write things down, but the quill was dry, and he'd forgotten the ink 3 years ago. Still, people respected the performance. That was the key. The villagers didn't want a Reeve who solved problems. They wanted one who noticed them, made a serious face, and then moved along like a man burdened with invisible calculations. He made his way to the pigsty, which wasn't part of his official round, but had become a personal ritual. The pigs liked him. He didn't know why. Maybe it was his pace. Maybe it was because he never asked anything of them. He leaned on the gate, watching as one snorted and rolled in the mud with theatrical joy. "Must be nice," he muttered. Back through the main path, he passed the blacksmith, who was hammering something too hot and too loud to be polite. Edin raised a hand. "Fences holding up?" The blacksmith grunted. It might have been yes. It might have been go away. By the time he reached the final corner of the village, the place where the old millstone had been turned into a bench, the sun was high and his job was technically done. He sat, exhaled, and removed his badge, setting it on his lap like a paper weight of responsibility. He'd accomplished little. Nothing had been fixed. No scrolls had been written. But every eye that had seen him knew the reeve had made his round. That was enough. A boy ran past with a broken bucket, trailed by a trail of drips and laughter. Ed watched him go, leaned back on the stone bench, and gazed out across the village. It was all still standing. Mostly, the fences could wait. The mice weren't unionized, and if the sky didn't fall before supper, he'd call it another successful day. Boredom Noli endured. That was the real job. It began, as most disasters masquerading as joy do, with a bell. A single sharp clang rang out from the center of the village square just after dawn. No one was scheduled to ring it. It wasn't a feast day. No saint was being honored. The crops hadn't done anything worth celebrating. And yet, the bell tolled, echoing through morning mist, like a question no one wanted to answer. Then came the shouting. Festival day. Someone cried. No one could say who. The words leapt from mouth to mouth, like sparks in a dry barn. By the time the sun cleared the trees, it was already being repeated as fact. It's festival day. Of course it is. Long live the festival. What are we celebrating? Doesn't matter. Pie's involved. And that was enough. The baker, still in his nightshirt, stumbled outside to find 3 women banging on his shutters. "We need 20 pies," they declared. "I haven't made dough," he replied. "Then make some," they said, "or the festival gods will be angry." He blinked. "We have festival gods today." "We do." The blacksmith's apprentice began tying ribbons to a fence post. The fence post collapsed. He tied them to a goat instead. The goat, named Oswald, and already known for questionable decision-making, took this as a sign of political ascension and began headbutting barrels with imperial pride. By mid-morning, the square was unrecognizable. Someone had dragged out a fiddle, someone else, who had never played the flute before, but claimed a strong family resemblance to those who had attempted to join in. The result was music. If music could be defined broadly enough to include wailing cats and stepped-on ducks, the butcher declared he'd host a competition. Guess what's in this pie? Entry was free. Regret was not. A group of children reenacted a heroic tale of Sir Turnip and the Dragon of Dirt, which involved one boy wearing a bucket and another pretending to breathe fire with the help of an unfortunate chili pepper. An old woman blessed them both. No one knew if she was an actual healer or just enjoying the moment. At the edge of the crowd, the priest stood squinting in confusion. "Who sanctioned this? You did. Father." Someone lied. "Oh," he said. "Well, let us give thanks." He raised his hands. A cheer went up. The cheer had nothing to do with him. It was because the goat had just stolen someone's hat and was wearing it with undeniable style. Banners appeared, though no one could recall owning banners. One was clearly a bedsheet. Another had suspiciously familiar embroidery from someone's Sunday tunic, but hung high and flapping in the breeze. They looked official enough to convince even the skeptics. There was dancing. There was tripping disguised as dancing. There was something that could only be described as enthusiastic flailing from the reeve, who insisted he was performing a traditional harvest jig from his youth. The crowd politely avoided eye contact while giving him space. The pies, when they emerged, were diverse in both content and structural integrity. One was definitely just mashed beans inside a bread bowl. Another may have contained fish or soap. It was hard to tell. Everyone agreed to smile while chewing. The ale flowed early, too early. By noon, the blacksmith was serenading a pig. The pig, to its credit, seemed charmed. By 1, 2 arguments had broken out over whether this was a real holiday or just an elaborate prank. By 2, both parties were drunk enough to agree that it didn't matter. "Should we do this every year?" someone shouted. "Yes," someone else replied. "Especially the pies." "No, not the pies," shouted a third, mouth still full. Children raced in circles. A man juggled 3 onions and then sneezed himself into unconsciousness. The goat climbed the hay cart and attempted a speech. No one understood it, but the applause was thunderous. As afternoon settled into its lazier phase, the square became a sea of napping bodies and crumpled paper crowns. The fiddler had broken 2 strings. The flute had been lost in a barrel. Someone passed around honey cakes that were mostly just honey with regrets. The priest eventually sat beside the baker, both men sipping from the same jug. "What are we celebrating again?" the baker asked. "Unity," said the priest, squinting into the sun. "Or chaos. Maybe both. It's not a real holiday, is it? Is any of them?" the priest shrugged. People remembered joy. That seems worth ringing a bell over. They clinked cups. Somewhere the goat fell off the hay cart. By nightfall, torches flickered, songs stumbled, and the air grew thick with contented confusion. No one remembered who rang the bell. No one knew if it would happen again. But for one odd, inexplicable day, the village had celebrated something no one could name, and that somehow felt sacred. The village was asleep, or at least pretending to be. The hearths had burned low. The bread had hardened. The last dog had given up barking at shadows. But out in the meadow beyond the last fence post, the one that leaned like it had given up trying, something was happening. It always started the same. A whisper passed from mouth to mouth after supper, slipped between bites of stew and sips of weak ale. "They're going to the meadow tonight." No one said who. No one needed to. The meadow, flat and moon-soaked, was where young villagers went when they had things to say that couldn't survive the daylight. Things like, "I think I love you," or "We shouldn't have done that," or "What if we just ran away and became candle merchants?" The moon tonight was full and nosy, hanging fat over the treetops like it wanted a front row seat. Crickets chirped with gossiping rhythm. The air smelled of grass, woods and nerves. Marigold was the first to arrive. Her hair braided so tightly it gave away how long she'd spent preparing. She stood near the old oak, pretending to admire the view while counting her breaths. Beside her, tucked under her sleeve, was a wilted posy, Not fresh, but intentional. A token, a maybe. Soon came Tom. Boots muddy, shirt clean, unusual, which meant something was afoot. He paced 3 steps to the left, then 2 to the right, then started over. The moon watched him. So did Marigold, though she didn't say a word. Elsewhere, behind the blackberry bushes, Elsie and Marta whispered like they were planning a heist. He's going to ask her tonight. No, he's not. He told Joran. Joran lies. He was crying when he said it. Could be allergies. The 2 girls paused to watch a pair stumbling over the hilltop. Hands clasped awkwardly, like they hadn't decided if it was romantic or a negotiation. Down by the riverbank, someone was singing badly. Someone else hushed them. A 3rd person started clapping to the beat. The village night was alive with potential disasters. Then came the first proposal. It wasn't dramatic, just a boy kneeling in a puddle, offering a bent ring in a shaky sentence. I know I've got nothing, but maybe we could have nothing together. The girl blinked, said nothing, then kissed him hard enough to startle a nearby owl. He forgot how to stand. She forgot how to breathe. Not far off, someone else tried the same, but fumbled. Will you? Do you want to? If I built a hut, would she stared at him? That's your pitch. He wilted. There'd be goats. I'm allergic to goats. The moon did not blink. It merely listened. Under its watch, a dozen almost lovers stumbled through half-confessions, whispered dreams, and impulsive handholds. Someone sang again, louder this time. Someone sobbed beside a log. Another person offered a bracelet made of twine and regret. At least 2 proposals were accepted. One was sealed with a promise to not be as annoying next year. The other was sealed with a pinky swear and a spit handshake. But not everyone left glowing. Lena waited an hour under the hawthorn tree, clutching a note in her sleeve. He never came. She burned the note with a flint and walked home barefoot, wiping her eyes like they were just adjusting to the moonlight. Gareth proposed to the wrong girl by mistake. In the dark, cloaks look awfully similar. She laughed until she cried. He cried until he laughed. They both agreed to pretend it never happened. 2 boys stood side by side in silence for 20 minutes. One eventually said, "Well, good night." The other nodded. Both stayed 5 more minutes just in case. The priest's daughter, who wasn't supposed to be there at all, kissed someone behind the old millstone and immediately whispered, "I think I've made a terrible mistake." He replied, "I think I've made a great one." The goat was there, too, somehow, wearing a garland, possibly betrothed. By the time the stars began to fade and the horizon hinted at grey, the meadow looked like the aftermath of a very emotional harvest. Bits of ribbon, forgotten shoes, a crushed flower crown, the kind of mess you only get when too many hearts are left slightly open. One couple walked home in silence, fingers brushing occasionally, not quite ready to hold hands, but too hopeful not to try again tomorrow. One boy ran. Just ran for no reason, except that he'd said something stupid, and the only way to outpace shame was with feet. And somewhere alone beneath the tree, Marigold still stood. Tom had never come over. She waited until the sky turned pale, then dropped the posy, turned around, and walked home with a dignity that cracked only once when she tripped on a root. By morning, no one would speak of it, not directly, but glances would linger. Smiles would mean more, and two people would avoid each other until next week, when the awkwardness wore off or blossomed into something worse. Midnight had been kind to some, cruel to others, but it had been honest. And in the year of our Lord, honesty under the moon was as close to magic as most villagers ever got. Evening vespers had just begun, and the chapel smelled like wax and wet wool. The priest had cleared his throat precisely twice, the exact number needed to signal divine readiness, and the villagers had settled into their usual formation, solemn, mildly damp, and trying not to sneeze. Candles flickered like they too were trying to stay awake. Rain tapped gently on the chapel roof, and the choir boys were humming the Preheim hum, which was not official, but had become a tradition in the way that all things done repeatedly tend to become sacred. Then came the chicken. It entered like a ghost, with no fanfare and no apology, slipping through the open side door, left ajar by a latecomer named Ellis, who would later deny everything. At first, no one noticed. The chicken moved with the kind of stealth usually reserved for sinners and tax collectors. It was a modest chicken, brown, feathered, bead-eyed, possibly sentient. It strutted halfway down the aisle before anyone made a sound. It was the blacksmith's daughter who saw it first. "There's a chicken," she whispered. Her brother shushed her. "No, look, it's under the third bench." The priest paused mid-sentence. "He who swears in sorrow shall reap in." Cluck. The sound echoed louder than it should have. The villagers trained in the sacred art of ignoring awkward things in sacred places remained frozen, except the chicken, who had now perched itself near the altar and was pecking curiously at a discarded bit of wax. The priest closed his book. "Did anyone bring that?" The silence said no. The silence also said, "Let's all agree to pretend it's not happening." Then the chicken flapped. One mighty burst of feathers and indignation, and suddenly it was in the air briefly before landing squarely in the lap of old Hilda, who had not been sat on by a living creature in over 3 decades. She let out a yelp that turned into a cough, that turned into a blasphemous mutter, which was enough to wake even the snorers in the back pew. Chaos bloomed. Children shrieked. Grown men ducked. Someone threw a hymnal, not at the chicken, but in its general direction, as if the spirit of Somali might banish poultry. The priest attempted a prayer, but what came out was, "Lord, deliver us from Cluck." The chicken leapt again, landed on the pulpit, and stared at the congregation like a visiting dignitary from the realm of farmyard heresy. Then it began to pin. "That is not a holy bird," muttered the apothecary. The priest, sweating now, raised his arms as if to summon angels. "This is the work of the devil. The devil's name is Margaret," shouted one of the children, pointing with glee. And just like that, the chicken had a name. Margaret strutted to the edge of the pulpit, clucked once, then hopped down and made for the baptismal font. "She's going for the water," someone cried. "She seeks redemption," someone else offered. At this point, the chapel was split into 3 factions. Those trying to catch Margaret, those trying not to laugh, and those who had accepted this as part of the liturgy and were humming softly to themselves. The priest was not among the amused. He chased Margaret with a ceremonial candle, shouting something about unclean spirits and poultry in sacred spaces. The candle went out. Margaret escaped. The children cheered. The baker's wife tried to trap her using her shawl. The shawl got torn. Margaret escaped again. Eventually, it was the youngest choir boy, small, quiet, and mostly ignored, who simply crouched and held out a piece of bread. Margaret approached slowly, suspiciously, then took the bread. He scooped her up, arms full of feathers and triumph, and held her like a relic. The congregation applauded. The priest tried to restore order. "Aham, let us return to prayer," he said, adjusting his robes in pride. Margaret was carried out with great ceremony, as if she were a visiting saint being respectfully exiled. Evening prayers resumed, shakier than before. Every few minutes, someone would stifle a giggle. The blacksmith's wife wiped tears from her cheeks. The reeve swore he'd seen a sign. The priest pretended not to see the feather still floating gently near the altar. After the final amen, people filed out quietly, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Except for the children, they clustered near the steps, whispering to each other. "She's our chicken now," one declared. "She's chosen. Margaret the Holy, Margaret the Terrible." They couldn't agree on her title, but they did agree she should live in the shed behind the chapel and be fed every Wednesday. No one asked the priest's permission. That night, the village slept with the vague, amused satisfaction of people who had witnessed something both ridiculous and vaguely divine. The stars above twinkled like candlelight, and somewhere behind the chapel, Margaret nestled into a pile of straw, unaware that she had achieved accidental sainthood. And in the village's collective memory, long after the candles had burned out and the hymeneals had been repaired, this night would be known simply as the time Margaret invaded the chapel, and everything got just a little more holy. By the time the last chores were done, and the wind had curled its fingers through the thatched rooftops, the villagers began to gather, not by invitation, never that formal, but by instinct, as if the crackling hearth sent out a silent summons to all souls within earshot. One by one they slipped inside the great hall beside the tavern where the fire burned steady, and the benches were just soft enough to tolerate for an hour or two. The flames danced against soot, darkened stone, painting shadows on the walls that looked like giants one moment and chickens the next. The room smelled of smoke, damp wool, old onions, and the faintest trace of me. A pot hung over the fire, bubbling something that claimed to be soup, though it was mostly memories and a single carrot floating like a survivor. Children curled in corners, chewing bread crusts and pretending not to fall asleep. Elders leaned on elbows. Middle-aged men stretched out their legs in exaggerated comfort, even as they quietly rubbed their knees. Women passed around a cloth of boiled chestnuts and made quiet bets about how long it would take before someone mentioned dragons. Then came the stories. It always started with Tolan, the miller's cousin. No one knew what exactly he did. Somewhere between brewing, borrowing, and bothering, but he had a voice like gravel and a gift for exaggeration. Did I ever tell you about the time I met the ghost in the barley fields? A chorus of groans, a few grins. "Yes," shouted the children. "No," shouted Tolan, ignoring them. That was his brother. This was the older ghost, meaner, drunker, smelled like turnips. The story spiraled quickly. Barley that whispered, a ghost with one boot and a fondness for whistling at sheep. A chase that ended with Tolan locked in a grain bin overnight. You just passed out in there, muttered someone. Semantics, he replied. Next came Ma, who claimed she once knew a man who wrestled a bear for romantic reasons. No one believed her, especially since the bear was later revealed to be a very large dog, and the romance ended in a splintered fence and 2 missing teeth. Still, she told it well, and her voice rose and fell like a fiddle tune, making even the nonsense feel noble. Then there was Wilfred, who always told the same story about a chicken that laid an egg shaped like a perfect cube. Every time the details changed slightly. Tonight, the chicken's name was Judith, and the egg was mistaken for a dice and used in a game that ended a marriage. Between stories, mugs clinked, logs shifted, and someone threw another stick on the fire. Sparks jumped like they had somewhere to be. A hush fell when old Bram spoke up. He rarely did. He was missing 2 fingers and all of his patience. But he told stories like he'd bottled time. This one's true, he said, which was how you knew it absolutely wasn't. He told of a knight who had no horse, only a very determined goat named Cyril. The knight rode Cyril into battle, or tried to, and the goat responded by eating part of his armor. They never made it past the village gate, but somehow Bram spun it into a tale of destiny, betrayal, and goat-based prophecy. By the end, people were wiping tears from their eyes, some from laughter, others from sheer confusion. The fire snapped louder, as if laughing, too. Children now dozed, heads on laps, breath slow and deep. One boy dreamed with his eyes open, staring into the flames like they might tell a story back. Outside, the wind howled just once, a reminder that the world beyond the hearth was wide and cold and uncaring. But in here, the walls held steady. The laughter held longer. Ria told a tale of a man who sneezed so hard it dislodged a tooth and changed the outcome of a local election. Someone else added a bit about a woman who claimed to hear bees in her bread, which turned out to be true, and the bread had to be exorcised. I once saw a duck walk into the tavern, quack 3 times, and leave. Was it a real duck? Define real. The stories blurred into one another like watercolors left in the rain. Impossible to separate truth from jest or memory from invention. And that was the point. Stories weren't for recourtiping. They were for warmth, for distraction, for stretching a single evening into something that felt longer, fuller, and less ordinary. Eventually, the yawns came in waves. Boots scraped the floor. Cloaks were pulled tight. One by one, the villagers stood, nodded good nights, and slipped back into the night. Only the fire remained awake, low and glowing, whispering to the last embers about goats and ghosts and the strange things people believe when the stars are out and the stew's been shared. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend, cows to milk, pies to burn. But tonight there had been dragons and square eggs, and the memory of laughter echoing in the smoke. Night fell slowly, as if it too was reluctant to lie down in this particular village. The last embers of daylight slipped behind the hills, and one by one candles were snuffed out. Shutters creaked closed, and people climbed into beds that could generously be described as wooden excuses for comfort. Inside the cottages, the world narrowed. The clatter and chatter of day faded into the soft rustle of blankets stuffed with straw. The occasional clink of a chamber pot lid and the heavy sighs of bodies surrendering to sleep or trying to. It was not a peaceful process. Snoring began almost immediately. Not a soft, dignified snore, but a full-throated furniture rattling declaration of unconsciousness. The sort of sound that suggested the sleeper was in a wrestling match with his own throat and winning decisively. It started in the blacksmith's hut, always him. And then, as if in reply, another snore erupted from 3 doors down, slightly higher in pitch, like a duet no one had asked for. A dog whimpered in its sleep. A baby coughed once and then decided against waking. The wind tapped a loose shutter. Somewhere, someone muttered, "Turn over, you old donkey," and received a grunt in response, followed by a loud, wet-sounding fart. That, too, was the nightly symphony. Flatulence had no shame in this village. It was considered a sign of health, vigor, and occasionally victory. The baker's wife had once claimed her husband farted so loudly it scared the rats out of the grain store. Whether this was true or not, the rats were gone, and the baker was proud. Tonight, the gas was especially sociable. A rhythmic series echoed from the Tor's cottage, followed by laughter. He and his wife made a game of guessing what animal each one sounded like. "That was definitely a goose," she whispered. In another hut, 2 teenage boys lay on opposite ends of a lumpy mattress, giggling like fools. "Did you hear that?" "No, that was you." Was not felt the draught. They dissolved into giggles again, muffling the sound with pillows that had once been sacks of grain. And through it all, the fleas partied. They were the true insomniacs of the village, tiny tyrants of the mattress realm. As soon as human skin made contact with straw, the fleas leapt into action like it was opening night at the theatre. Bites were delivered with precision. Itches bloomed like unwanted flowers. People scratched in their sleep. Some moaned softly. One woman, half awake, slapped her leg and whispered, "Got you, you little demon," before rolling over triumphantly. The apothecary claimed to have a flea-repelling salve made of garlic, mint, and hopeless optimism. It worked for exactly 1 night. Then the fleas came back with reinforcements. Dreams stirred, strange and slippery. The blacksmith dreamt of a dancing cow that judged him harshly. A young girl imagined her chicken could talk and accused her of theft. The reeve, noble even in slumber, muttered official-sounding things about fences and cabbage law. He would deny it all come morning. In the manor house, the steward snored so rhythmically it was mistaken for drumming. The housemaid dreamt of a feast where all the spoons had legs and ran away just before the soup was served. In one cottage, a widow dreamed of her husband. Not how he was, but how she wished he had been. He didn't snore in the dream. He smelled of rosemary and knew how to dance. Down in the common house, the last fire sputtered in the hearth. One man sat upright in his sleep, eyes fluttering, muttering about taxes and trousers. His bunkmate nudged him flat again. Even the animals had joined the chorus. A pig snorted in its pen, chasing something in its sleep. Perhaps a runaway apple, perhaps a grudge. The goats murmured softly, and one sneezed with such force it scared the other into tipping over a bucket. The night deepened. The stars blinked, distant and unimpressed. The moon crept across the sky, peering through thin windows, lighting up crooked noses and open mouths, tattered quilts and dangling feet. Outside, the wind sang its own lullaby through the trees. A barn door creaked. A frog chirped once, decided against it, and went back to doing nothing. And in the village, sleep held most in its arms. Not tenderly, not gently, but effectively, despite the snores and farts, the scratching and muttering, the dreams and itches. The people slept because this was life. Loud, itchy, slightly embarrassing, and tomorrow would come soon with roosters, burnt porridge, and someone pretending they hadn't talked in their sleep about marrying a goat. But for now, the village breathed, huffed, snored, and shuffled under the patchy quilt of night. And, in the darkness, a single flea paused, wiped its tiny face, and got back to work. The fire had gone out in most homes now. Just a thin ribbon of smoke trailed from a few chimneys, curling up into the star-choked sky like a final sigh. The village had quieted, not silenced, never that, but hushed as if the earth itself had pulled up a woolen blanket and settled in. But there was always one last task. Tomlin pulled on his boots by feel, not sight. They were still damp from the stream, and one had a bit of straw lodged inside. But he didn't complain. He was used to it. He lifted the lantern with a grunt, its light dim but warm, and stepped out into the cool breath of night. His wife mumbled something from the bed. Probably, "Don't forget the latch." Or maybe just turnip soup. But he nodded anyway. Out in the yard, the ground was soft and forgiving, still holding the day's warmth in its belly. He made his way past the lianto, past the rain barrel, past the patch of stubborn weeds that had resisted 3 seasons of insults. The barn loomed ahead, more shadow than structure now, its roof sagging slightly like an old man bowing to the moon. He pushed the door open with a creak that felt louder than it should have, as if the wood were complaining about being disturbed so late. Inside, the barn was alive in the way nighttime barns always are. A soft rustle here, a gentle snort there, straw shifting like it had secrets. The smell hit him, familiar and oddly comforting. A mixture of hay, manure, damp wood, and the unexplainable scent that only animals seem to make. "All right," Tomlin whispered. "Just one last look." He walked past the chickens first. Most were huddled in clumps, dreaming of worms and dominance. One lifted its head, blinked at him with reptilian judgment, and tucked itself back into feathered sleep. The goat pen came next. The twins, Mumble and Crick, were tangled together in a way that defied logic and physics. One of them chewed something in its sleep. Tomlin didn't ask what. Then came the main event, Gertrude. She was the largest animal in the village, possibly the oldest, definitely the loudest. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about expressing them. If the world wasn't to her liking, she'd let you know with a kick, a bellow, or a long pointed stare that seemed to pass judgment on your entire lineage. But tonight, Gertrude was quiet. She lay curled in the straw like a great hairy boulder. Her breathing was slow and steady. Her eyes, half-lidded, tracked Tomlin's approach with the weary tolerance of someone who has lived too long to be surprised by anything anymore. He knelt beside her. "You all right, girl?" he asked softly. She blinked once, then closed her eyes. "That's what I thought." He reached out and gently scratched the patch behind her ear. She liked, the one that made her twitch her nose and groan like a spoiled baroness. She didn't twitch tonight. Just a long exhale, warm and damp, and the faintest shuffle of hooves against straw. Tomlin stayed there for a while, not doing anything, not thinking about anything either, just breathing with her, listening to the creaks of the barn, feeling the weight of the day loosen its grip. In the loft above, a mouse rustled, probably the same one that had been stealing from the grain sack all week. Tomlin didn't care tonight. Let it have its crumbs. He stood, bones creaking louder than the barn door. "Good night, Gertrude," he whispered. She didn't reply. Outside, the stars were still watching. Thousands of them scattered across the sky like forgotten seeds. Some bright, some faint, all ancient. He paused and looked up just for a second. No prayers, no thoughts, just a glance, just enough to feel small in the right way. Back inside, the village was deep in its dreams. The baker rolled over and muttered about burnt crusts. The priest mumbled an unfinished sermon. A child somewhere whispered, "Dragon," then snored like one. Even the dogs were still, their tails twitching at memories of rabbits that had gotten away. Tomlin slipped back into the house, careful not to let the door squeal. He set the lantern down, pulled off his boots, slid beneath the blanket beside his wife, who reached out without waking, and placed a hand on his chest like she was counting the beats. Outside, the barn stood watch. Inside, Gertrude sighed, rolled once, and finally settled. And above it all, the stars blinked, slow and silent, keeping secrets only the night could understand.